In a moment that stunned the world, Donald J. Trump, former President of the United States and ever the master of controversy, refused to kneel before the newly elected Pope Leo XIV during a high-profile visit to the Vatican. What was meant to be a symbolic meeting of power and tradition quickly spiraled into a global media storm, pitting two titanic egos against one another on the most sacred ground in Christendom. But what really happened behind those ancient walls? And why did Trump's refusal send tremors through the hearts of the Catholic Church? This is the untold story of defiance, diplomacy, and a secret that could alter the course of history. It all began not with a public statement or a tweet, but with a formal letter embossed with the golden seal of the Vatican and hand-delivered by a discreet envoy under tight security. The recipient, Donald J. Trump. The sender, His Holiness Pope Leo XIV, the newly elected pontiff, who had already earned a reputation as one of the most unorthodox leaders the Catholic Church had ever seen. The letter was brief, but profound. It invited Trump to attend a historic unity convocation in Vatican City, a gathering of world leaders, religious figures, scholars, and visionaries intended to symbolize a new era of spiritual diplomacy. The theme was global reconciliation. The timing, however, could not have been more delicate. Just 6 months prior, Pope Leo XIV had succeeded a deeply traditional predecessor. The Church, long steeped in ceremonial restraints and doctrinal rigidity, was being shaken at its foundations by the Pope's bold reforms. He had spoken openly about the need to reimagine the Church's role in modern politics. He had washed the feet of refugees on live television. He had even suggested, to the shock of many within the Curia, that faith and power must be rebalanced in a post-imperial world. So why Trump? The choice baffled insiders. Among the invited guests were predictable names: European prime ministers, African peace negotiators, South American liberation theologians, and tech billionaires with philanthropic halos. But Trump's inclusion seemed symbolic, perhaps even deliberate. The Vatican claimed it was a gesture of openness, to include voices from across the ideological spectrum. Yet rumours swirled. Some insiders whispered that Leo XIV saw Trump not as a guest, but as a necessary disruption to an outdated spiritual hierarchy. Trump's advisors were initially divided. Some believed the invitation was a trap, an attempt to humiliate him on the world stage. Others saw it as an opportunity to reclaim global relevance, to be seen once again walking among kings and saints. Trump himself was said to have been amused. "The Pope wants me to come kneel. We'll see," he reportedly told one advisor with a grin. The preparations were intense. The Vatican readied its finest chambers, reserved a private suite for the former president within the Apostolic Palace, and enhanced security to levels not seen since the Cold War. White-robed Swiss guards polished their halberds. Behind the scenes, a private team of translators, diplomats, and spiritual envoys rehearsed every possible outcome, aware that the eyes of billions would soon be watching. Meanwhile, Trump was crafting his own message. He didn't see this as a spiritual retreat or an olive branch. He saw it as a stage. "It's not just a visit," he told one confidant. "It's a negotiation of power." Within the Vatican walls, skepticism and concern grew. Cardinals debated behind closed doors. One bishop from Milan reportedly exclaimed, "If he refuses the knee, it will be a scandal of biblical proportions." Another countered, Or perhaps it is a mirror, showing us what we have become in the eyes of the world. The Pope himself remained calm. When asked privately what he hoped to achieve, Leo XIV offered a cryptic response. Sometimes the temple must be disturbed before it is rebuilt. On the day of his departure, Trump boarded a private jet, coated in gold trim and flying under a discreet call sign. Accompanying him were a select team of advisors, a personal videographer, and several religious consultants. They were tight-lipped about the trip's true purpose. The media speculated feverishly. CNN called it a spiritual power summit. Fox News described it as a potential clash of titans. Conspiracy forums lit up with theories ranging from papal mind control to secret prophecies buried beneath the Sistine Chapel. When Trump's jet touched down on Vatican soil, crowds had already gathered along the stone streets. Pilgrims and protesters stood shoulder to shoulder. Some held signs that read, "Peace in our time." Others displayed portraits of Trump wearing a crown of thorns. Church bells rang solemnly, not as a celebration, but as a warning. As his motorcade approached the Vatican gates, an eerie silence fell. No words were spoken. No cheers erupted. Just the slow, deliberate turning of heads as the convoy rolled past centuries-old statues of saints and martyrs. In that moment, the tension was not just political, it was spiritual. It was as if the old world and the new were about to collide, and no one could predict what would be left standing. The grand interior of St. Peter's Basilica had never looked more radiant. Rays of golden sunlight filtered through the towering stained glass windows, casting halos of light across the polished marble floor. The air was thick with incense and anticipation. Hundreds of robed clergy stood silently along the aisles. Choirs from every corner of the world, Ghanaian gospel singers, Mongolian throat chanters, Vatican-trained sopranos, harmonized in a once-in-a-lifetime sacred performance that echoed off the centuries-old stone. The moment had been choreographed down to the second. Each world leader would approach Pope Leo XIV in a symbolic gesture of global humility and shared reverence. Not a political endorsement, the Vatican stressed, but a public acknowledgement of the Pope's role as a moral figurehead. Every kneel, every bow, every kiss upon the papal ring had been rehearsed as part of a powerful display of unity between the sacred and secular worlds. Trump, seated toward the front, flanked by his entourage, and dressed in a dark, sharply tailored suit with a crimson tie, was quiet, but not passive. Observers noted the way his eyes moved, not in awe of the basilica's grandeur, but in calculation, as if scanning a battlefield. This wasn't reverence, it was reconnaissance. When his name was announced, President Donald John Trump, United States of America, a hush fell over the congregation. Cameras pivoted. Smartphones rose in the hands of both cardinals and civilians alike, despite a strict ban on personal recording. Even seasoned diplomats inhaled sharply. It was as if the very walls of the basilica leaned in to watch. Trump rose slowly. He buttoned his jacket with deliberate precision and walked down the centre aisle toward the papal throne. It was a long walk, and he took his time. Every step echoed. Some saw confidence, others saw defiance. At the top of the steps stood Pope Leo XIV, dressed not in ornate gold and crimson, but in stark white robes and simple leather sandals. He extended his hand, open, gentle, waiting. Tradition dictated what would come next. Trump would kneel, he would bow his head, he would kiss the ring, and the ceremony would move on. But instead, Trump stopped. Mid-step, a few feet from the Pope, he paused. The air grew heavy. The choir faltered ever so slightly. Those watching remotely around the globe could feel it. Something had shifted. Trump didn't lower himself. He didn't kneel. Instead, he raised his head, looked the Pope directly in the eye, and with a voice clear and commanding, he said, "With all due respect, I kneel for no man. Not now, not ever." A sound burst through the basilica that no one could quite identify. It was not a gasp, not a murmur, not a cry. It was something deeper, ancient, like the groan of history itself being disturbed. A cardinal's staff clattered to the floor. One nun reportedly fainted. A small group of pilgrims from Argentina began to weep silently. The Pope stood motionless, his expression unreadable. Some said he looked amused. Others insisted there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. He did not withdraw his hand, nor did he speak. The silence lasted nearly a full minute, an eternity in ceremonial time. Then, with the eyes of billions locked onto him, Trump slowly reached out, not to kiss the ring, but to shake the Pope's hand. A firm, business-like grip. Two titans meeting not as servant and shepherd, but as equals. Pope Leo XIV finally spoke, just 3 words. "Then let us begin." What followed was chaos and calm at once. Inside the basilica, the next leaders in line hesitated, unsure whether to follow tradition or Trump's precedent. The Kenyan president knelt. The Japanese Prime Minister offered a respectful bow. The German Chancellor merely nodded. The unity ceremony, meant to be seamless, had been fractured. Outside, news networks erupted. Within minutes, how Trump and the Pope was trending worldwide. On conservative channels, Trump was hailed as a beacon of independence, a leader who stood firm in his values. On liberal platforms, he was condemned as arrogant and disrespectful. Religious scholars debated the implications in real time. Had he blasphemed? Or had he merely redefined reverence in a secular age? The Vatican press office released a carefully worded statement. It neither condemned nor condoned Trump's actions. The Church recognises the spiritual dignity of every person, it read, and honours the mystery of individual conscience. But behind the scenes, tension surged through the marble halls. Within hours, whispers of ancient traditions violated, of prophecies stirred, and of power dynamics shifted began circulating among the Vatican elite. It wasn't just that Trump had refused to kneel. It was when he had done it, where, and to whom. The act was not just a personal choice, it was a symbolic rupture in centuries of spiritual hierarchy. The Pope, later that evening, was seen walking alone through the Vatican gardens. A lone Swiss guard followed at a distance. When asked by a young priest if he was disturbed by the day's events, Pope Leo XIV replied, "When the tower shakes, we must listen, not to the stones, but to what emerges from beneath them." And so, what began as a single refusal, one man choosing not to bend the knee, would soon become a question asked in cathedrals, mosques, and parliaments around the world. Who has the right to kneel? And who has the strength not to? Inside the Vatican walls, the silence following Trump's refusal to kneel was deceptive. On the surface, The proceedings of the Unity Convocation resumed with diplomatic grace, the choir lifting once more in celestial harmony, the next dignitaries stepping forward with practised humility. But within the minds of the Vatican elite, a storm was already gathering. By the time the ceremony concluded, Pope Leo XIV had quietly exited the basilica through a discreet corridor behind the apse, escorted by only 2 members of the Pontifical Swiss Guard. No interviews were given, no statements were made. The Pope had chosen silence, a powerful silence that spoke louder than any rebuke. But the Curia, the powerful inner circle of cardinals and archbishops who advised and debated church doctrine, did not share his composure. That evening, deep within the Apostolic Palace, a closed-door meeting was called in the Sala Ducale, a high-ceilinged room reserved for moments of extreme sensitivity. The participants were carefully chosen, only the most trusted, most senior clerics. Most had served through multiple papacies. Some had been in their robes longer than Trump had been alive. Their expressions were solemn. Some were visibly shaken. Others openly furious. "He insulted the chair of St. Peter," thundered Cardinal Menendez of Spain, slamming his fist on the polished oak table. "He turned a sacred ritual into a sideshow." Cardinal Udom of Nigeria countered sharply. "Or perhaps he held up a mirror. We asked him here to symbolize humility. Did we not realize we were also inviting defiance?" The debate raged on, splitting along not just theological, but generational lines. Older clergy invoked the sanctity of tradition, arguing that Trump's actions had humiliated not just the Pope, but the divine authority he represents. Younger members of the Curia, however, wondered aloud whether this rupture was inevitable, a symptom of the world's changing perception of power, reverence, and spiritual legitimacy. The Pope did not attend the meeting, nor did he send a representative. His absence was more unsettling than his presence would have been. It left the cardinals without direction, without insight into how Leo XIV interpreted the act. Was he insulted, intrigued, amused? In the hours that followed, the Vatican's communications department faced a crisis unlike any in recent memory. Journalists from across the globe flooded their inboxes with requests for clarification. Was Trump's refusal to kneel a deliberate insult or an expression of religious independence? Was the Pope offended? Would there be consequences? The official press release remained maddeningly neutral. His Holiness acknowledges that faith is expressed in many ways, it read, and dignity is not measured in posture alone. But behind the scenes, there were far more troubling conversations. One archivist, an elderly Jesuit who had served in the Vatican Library for decades, approached the Secretary of State with a trembling parchment in his hand. It was an obscure entry from a 15th century codex attributed to a forgotten mystic named Fra Leandro of Umbria. The passage, written in Latin, read, "And in the final days of shadowed glory, a man from the west, with a voice like fire and hair like gold, shall refuse the blessing of the fisherman's ring, and from this gesture shall begin the final war of mirrors, where truth and illusion are one." The archivist whispered only one sentence: "We may have witnessed the first omen." The secretary dismissed it with a weary sigh, but word of the prophecy spread quickly through the Vatican's inner sanctums. The gold-haired man from the west, the refusal of the Pope's ring, the war of mirrors. For some, it was nonsense. For others, It was chillingly specific. More alarming still was the effect Trump's actions had outside the Vatican. Within days, high-profile pastors, megachurch leaders, and alternative spiritual influencers began posting videos in support of him. They claimed Trump had shown the world that no man, not even a pope, should be revered above the individual's direct connection to God. The act was being reframed not as disrespect, but as revolutionary faith. One American evangelist even declared on live television, "Trump did what Martin Luther would have done in Rome today. He stood before power and said, 'Only God deserves my devotion.'" The Vatican's diplomatic offices began receiving uncomfortable messages from allied states. Some were polite inquiries. Others were more pointed. Was the Pope planning to issue a response? Would the Catholic Church clarify its position? Had global religious protocol changed? Even more troubling were the internal divisions that began to emerge within the Church itself. A group of young seminarians in Brazil released a statement praising Trump's resistance to spiritual imperialism. A conservative bishop in Poland condemned the act as an abomination. Bishops in the Philippines and Canada offered more nuanced perspectives, calling it a challenge that invites us to re-examine the meaning of reverence in a secular age. Meanwhile, inside the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV remained curiously silent. He had not spoken publicly since the incident. When a journalist shouted a question during a brief balcony appearance, "Do you condemn Donald Trump's actions?" the Pope simply turned, paused, and walked back inside. But those closest to him noticed subtle changes. He spent more time in the Apostolic Library. He requested access to restricted theological manuscripts. One assistant noted that he had been rereading De Potestate Papae, a centuries-old treatise on the limits of papal authority. And then there was the art. In the days following the event, a little noticed change occurred in the Sala Regia, the grand hall where many official state visitors passed through. A painting that had hung there for over 300 years, depicting the coronation of Pope Pius V, was removed and replaced with a stark, modern depiction of Christ flipping over the tables in the temple. The message was unmistakable. Something was being overturned. What began as a moment of awkward silence in the basilica had grown into a theological, political, and symbolic earthquake. The Vatican, though cloaked in marble and mystery, had been shaken, not by armies or heresies, but by a refusal. A refusal that questioned not just papal authority, but the very nature of reverence in the modern world. And the Pope, quietly watching it all unfold, simply waited, because he knew this was only the beginning. While the world dissected Trump's dramatic refusal, and the Vatican struggled to regain narrative control, a far more ancient and ominous thread began to unravel deep within the hidden corridors of the Holy See. Not in front of cameras or in press conferences, but behind locked doors and within musty archives where sunlight had not touched parchment in centuries. It began with a question, whispered during a late-night meeting between two scholars at the Pontifical Lateran University. Has this happened before? Not the kneeling, not the politics, but the symbolism, the moment, the unsettling sensation that something far older had stirred. The Vatican Library, one of the oldest and most secretive repositories of knowledge in the world, became the epicenter of the inquiry. A group of archivists, linguists, and theologians were quietly assigned a task by Cardinal d'Argento, a powerful figure within the Curia, known for his obsession with esoteric prophecy. Their goal was not to investigate Trump himself, but rather to trace the symbolic echoes of what had just occurred, to find if the refusal to kneel had been foretold. They began with the usual suspects: Saint Malachy, Nostradamus, the apocalyptic writings of Hildegard of Bingen. But nothing seemed precise enough. The famous Prophecies of the Popes by Saint Malachy, written in the 12th century and long dismissed as either forgery or metaphor, provided a cryptic roadmap of papal reigns. Leo XIV, according to some interpretations, was the second to last name in the list. In Persecutione Extrema SRE sedebit, he who sits in the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church. The implications were grave. If Leo XIV was indeed the penultimate figure, then whoever or whatever followed would preside not over a church in power, but a church in crisis. A spiritual war. A collapse. A transformation. But it was an obscure 15th century manuscript from an anonymous Carthusian monk, found hidden behind a false panel in the library's Sezione Nera, that shifted the investigation from academic to urgent. This manuscript, barely legible, and written in a mixture of Latin, Greek, and strange sigils, contained a passage that stopped Cardinal d'Argento mid-reading. Roughly translated, it said, "In the era of the white-robed reformer, a man of flame shall refuse the kiss of the fisherman's ring. He shall be the golden disputer, born of towers and commerce, speaking in tongues of silver. His refusal will split the temple and awaken the eye beneath the stone." It was unsettlingly specific. The white-robed reformer aligned eerily with Pope Leo XIV, known for his simple garments and radical transparency. The golden disputer, a figure born of towers and commerce, with silver-tongued speech, felt undeniably Trumpian in symbolism. The refusal of the kiss was no longer just a shocking gesture. It was now being interpreted as the spark to ignite a hidden prophetic sequence. But what truly terrified the scholars was the final phrase: "Awaken the eye beneath the stone." It was not a metaphor. They believed it referred to something real, something buried, something the church had covered over. Under heavy secrecy, a small contingent of Vatican archaeologists and exorcists, yes, exorcists, was summoned to investigate the substructures beneath St. Peter's Basilica. These levels, older than the church itself, dated back to the Roman Empire and earlier. Beneath the bones of saints and martyrs were tunnels, tombs, and chambers sealed for centuries. In one such sealed chamber, behind a wall inscribed with protective sigils, they found a mosaic, cracked and faded, but unmistakable. It depicted a kneeling king in golden robes, refusing to touch a radiant ring held by a faceless man in white. Above them, an eye, open, inhuman, and weeping blood, loomed over a cracked dome. The mosaic had no inscription, no explanation. But the implication was clear. The symbolism was prophetic. The imagery matched. Meanwhile, Pope Leo XIV, fully aware of the internal investigations, made no attempt to intervene. He was seen increasingly alone, wandering the Vatican gardens at night, speaking to no one, holding a single item in his hand, a weathered, leather-bound book with no title, rumoured to be his private journal, or something even more arcane. He allowed the Curia to argue. He let the world media speculate. He gave no interviews, no clarifications. But then, unexpectedly, he made one simple request. A private viewing of the Profezia Oscura, the so-called Dark Prophecy scrolls hidden in the vault of St. Fabian, a level of security reserved for materials deemed too dangerous for even the papal archive. Only a handful of popes had ever been granted access to these scrolls. Leo XIV spent 3 days reading them in solitude. Afterward, he emerged not shaken, but solemn. He reportedly told his private secretary, "The prophecy has many endings. Some are fire, some are silence, but all of them begin the same way, with a refusal." Elsewhere in the world, religious scholars began to notice something strange. An increase in apocalyptic dreams reported among clergy, an outbreak of spontaneous stigmata in remote communities, and a rise in those claiming to have seen visions of a golden lion walking through a burning cathedral. Social media, naturally, turned these into viral trends, but in the Vatican, they were catalogued as omens, markers, the signs that something buried, not just under stone, but under centuries of doctrine, was now waking up. And the Pope's quiet smile, during his next appearance, was not the smile of serenity. It was the smile of someone who had just turned the page to a chapter the world wasn't ready to read. In the days following the encounter at the Vatican, Donald Trump returned to the United States to a wave of media frenzy, global debate, and political tension. But unlike the calculated silence from the Vatican, Trump was not interested in restraint. He had tasted something during that confrontation, an ancient drama, a spiritual theatre, and he wasn't going to let it fade into mystery, not when the world was watching. His team quickly organised what they called the American Faith Summit, to be held at Liberty Square in Florida, an open-air arena surrounded by colossal Roman columns and adorned with banners that fused American iconography with Christian symbols. The stage was immense, designed like a modern cathedral, with LED panels displaying a burning cross rising from an eagle's talon. The name of the event? God Alone. Tens of thousands gathered. They came from every corner of the country: evangelicals, nationalists, libertarians, prosperity gospel preachers, and those simply curious about what Trump would say after confronting the spiritual epicenter of the Catholic world. They weren't disappointed. He stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause, dressed in a dark suit, but this time, notably, without a tie, perhaps a subtle gesture of defiance against uniformity. He stood for several minutes in silence, letting the cheers swell and echo under the open sky. Then he raised one hand, not in a wave, but in a slow, deliberate upward motion, as if calling something unseen to rise. His speech began slowly, almost pastorally, not as a politician, but as a preacher. "They told me I would kneel," he began. "They told me that before God I must kneel before man. They wanted me to bow, not just to tradition, but to an idea that no longer fits the world we live in." He paused. "But I stood, not because I am greater, but because we are not lesser." The crowd erupted, flags waved, cameras flashed. In the front rows, grown men wept openly. Trump continued, building momentum like a revival preacher. The Pope may wear white, he may lead the oldest institution on earth, but let me be very clear. The days of submission are over. the age of the awakened man has begun. His rhetoric blurred political, religious, and prophetic lines. He quoted scripture, misquoted scripture, and invented new passages altogether. The temple must be torn down before it can be rebuilt, he said. The veil has already been torn, and now we see clearly. He began invoking visions, perhaps metaphorical, perhaps rehearsed. He claimed that after the meeting in Rome, he had dreams like fire, of marble crumbling, of a golden beast standing before a weeping throne. And I saw, he said, the eyes of the people opened, and I saw that we do not need intermediaries between us and God. No ring, no robes, just truth. By this point, the event had fully transformed. It was no longer a speech. It was a sermon, a ritual, a cultural exorcism. Members of the crowd began chanting, "No kneeling, no kings, no popes." Television networks were divided. Some refused to air it live, calling it religious provocation. Others broadcast every second, treating it as the rebirth of a spiritual movement. On fringe channels, commentators began referring to Trump not just as a leader, but as a prophet. Conspiracy groups called him the Lion of the Last Age. Merchants printed shirts with slogans like, "Only God, only Trump." Others photoshopped images of Trump standing on the Vatican steps, holding lightning in one hand and a scepter in the other. Meanwhile, in Rome, Pope Leo XIV watched the broadcast in silence. No advisors, no interruptions, just a single monitor in a dimly lit study. When it ended, he reportedly whispered to himself, "He has stepped beyond the gate." The Vatican issued no formal statement, but within hours, the Pope requested a private convocation of the Custodes Silenti, a shadowy order within the Church said to act in moments of metaphysical threat. An order whose existence had never been acknowledged in public records. Their purpose was not to fight demons or Protestants. Their purpose was to watch the thresholds of sacred reality, moments when prophecy and power crossed. And in their ancient manuscripts, carefully passed down through the centuries, one symbol appeared again and again. A golden lion facing the throne of God, refusing to kneel. Elsewhere, bizarre phenomena were reported across various cathedrals and churches. In Argentina, a statue of the Virgin Mary was said to have shed tears of ash. In Poland, the stained glass window of St. Peter cracked inward during a midnight mass. In the Philippines, a wooden crucifix reportedly caught fire without burning. Priests and bishops began writing urgent letters to the Vatican, fearful that some unseen force had been set into motion. In Washington, D.C., Trump gave another address, this time to a smaller, more select audience. With no cameras present, he reportedly spoke about the Vatican encounter in almost mystical terms. "When I looked into the Pope's eyes," he said, "I didn't see a man. I saw an institution, a fortress. I stood before a wall of centuries, and I did not flinch." His audience, a collection of Christian nationalists, tech entrepreneurs, and former intelligence officials, asked him what came next. Trump smiled and said, "The Reformation they feared, I am it." Behind closed doors, political advisors were less certain. Some warned that his spiritual rhetoric was alienating moderates. Others believed he had tapped into something far deeper than politics, something primal, tribal, even archetypal. And perhaps they were right. Within weeks, new religious groups began forming, unaffiliated with any church, rooted in a blend of American exceptionalism, spiritual self-reliance, and prophetic language. They called themselves the Standers. Their central tenet was simple: we kneel only to the Creator, not to popes, not to power. By now, what had started as a gesture of refusal had become a global movement. Scholars called it the theology of defiance. Critics warned of religious fragmentation. Supporters called it a second Reformation. But Pope Leo XIV was unmoved by the noise. He met with a small group of cardinals one night and spoke plainly. "We thought the enemy would come in red robes or black smoke, but sometimes," he said, "he comes in silence, wearing a crown of gold, whispering freedom." One cardinal asked, "Do you believe he is the one from the prophecy?" The Pope answered, "It does not matter who he is. What matters is that the world has already chosen to listen." And in the deep corridors of the Vatican, a great door was unlocked for the first time in centuries. Behind it was not a weapon or a relic, but a mirror, tall, ancient, and bound in scripture. Etched along its frame were the words, "Before the end, the world shall gaze into itself, and not all shall survive what they see." And as Pope Leo XIV stared into the glass, he saw a reflection not just of himself, but of every soul who had ever claimed to speak for God. And one, standing taller than the rest, unmoved and unbent, waiting.